Sarah Beth collapsed beside the woodpile, her swollen belly making it impossible to catch her breath. For 3 months she had chopped and hauled timber alone, her family having cast her out when her condition became undeniable. The Arizona Territory showed no mercy to the weak, and winter was coming fast. She never saw him approach. The Apache warrior had been watching her struggle from the ridge for weeks, his dark eyes taking in every stumble, every moment she pushed herself beyond what her body could bear. White settlers feared his kind, crossed themselves when they spoke, his name in hushed whispers. But when he saw her fall, something deeper than tribal loyalties stirred in his chest. He stepped from the shadows, his presence both terrifying and oddly comforting. What would drive a feared Apache warrior to risk everything for a woman his people considered an enemy? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The memory burned in Sarah Beth's mind like a brand pressed into flesh. She could still hear her father's voice echoing across the homestead that September morning, his words cutting deeper than any blade ever could. The family Bible lay open on the kitchen table, its leather binding worn smooth by 3 generations of Whitmore hands. But the page that had once recorded her birth in careful script now bore a jagged tear where her father had ripped it free. "You are no daughter of mine," he had declared, his weathered face hard as Arizona stone. Her mother stood behind him, silent tears streaming down her cheeks, her hands gripping the back of his chair as if it were the only thing keeping her upright. The shame of unmarried pregnancy in 1880s frontier society was a stain that could not be washed clean, a sin that demanded swift and merciless judgment. "Papa, please," Sarah Beth had whispered, one hand instinctively protective over the small swell of her belly. "I have nowhere to go." "Should have thought of that before you spread your legs for that no-account drifter," he spat, turning away from her, as if the very sight of her offended his righteous soul. "Pack your things. I want you gone before sundown." The drift, that's all Thomas Garrett had been to her family, though to Sarah Beth he had been everything: charming smile, gentle hands, promises whispered under star-filled skies. He had appeared at their door one evening in late spring, his horse lame and his story sad enough to earn him supper and a place in the barn. 3 weeks later he was gone, leaving nothing behind but empty promises and the child growing in her womb. She had packed everything that would fit in her father's old leather satchel, her possessions reduced to 2 dresses, a worn shawl, her mother's silver hairbrush, and the leather gloves that had been her father's before arthritis made them too painful to wear. As the sun touched the western mountains, painting the sky the color of fresh blood, Sarah Beth had walked away from the only home she had ever known. The abandoned cabin she found 3 miles north of town had once belonged to the Morrison family before Apache raids drove them back east. Its roof leaked in 2 places, the door hung crooked on rusted hinges, and the stone chimney had a crack that let smoke escape in dangerous wisps. But it offered shelter from the elements and enough privacy to hide her shame from the judgmental eyes of the community. For 2 weeks she survived on the meager supplies she had brought and the few vegetables still growing wild in the Morrisons' abandoned garden. But as autumn settled over the territory and the nights grew cold, she realized that survival would require more than hope and stubbornness. Winter in the Arizona mountains could kill the unprepared, and she was very much unprepared. The first time she lifted her father's old axe, her arms shook with the effort. The blade bit into the pine log with a dull thunk that seemed to mock her inexperience. By evening she had managed to split enough kindling to last 2 days, her hands bloody despite the protection of the leather gloves, her back screaming with pain that only worsened as her pregnancy advanced. But she learned, day by day, swing by swing, she taught herself the rhythm of survival. The axe grew familiar in her hands, its weight no longer foreign, its balance becoming part of her own. She learned to read the wood, to find the natural grain that would make each log split clean. She learned to stack the pieces properly so they would dry and burn hot when the snows came. Most importantly, she learned that she was stronger than she had ever imagined possible. From his position on the ridge overlooking the Morrison cabin, Coda watched the white woman's daily struggle with growing fascination. He had first noticed her 3 weeks ago during his morning hunt, a small figure moving awkwardly through the timber with an axe too heavy for her slight frame. His initial reaction had been dismissal, another settler too foolish to understand the harsh realities of frontier life, destined to flee or die when winter arrived. But she had not fled. Each morning she emerged from the leaking cabin. Each day she lifted the axe and attacked the woodpile with determination that bordered on desperation. He watched her stumble and fall, watched her rise and continue. He watched her rest more frequently as her belly swelled with child, watched her movements grow more labored as autumn deepened into the promise of winter. The eagle feather medallion that hung around his neck seemed to grow warm against his chest whenever he observed her struggles. His grandmother, wise in the old ways, had given him the medallion before her death, telling him it would guide him when the path forward seemed unclear. The spirits speak through signs and symbols, she had said, her ancient hands placing the leather cord around his young neck. When the feather grows warm, pay attention. The Creator is trying to tell you something. Coda had carried the medallion for 15 years, through raids and hunts, through the seasons of war that had consumed so much of his adult life. It had grown warm the night before the successful ambush of the cavalry patrol near Tucson. It had grown warm the morning he found the hidden spring that saved his hunting party from dying of thirst. And it had grown warm every single day for the past 3 weeks, as he watched the pregnant white woman fight for survival in the valley below. His people had good reason to hate the white settlers who had flooded into Apache lands like a plague of locusts. The blue-coated soldiers had burned villages, killed women and children, driven the Apache from hunting grounds their ancestors had used for countless generations. The settlers who followed built their farms and ranches on soil watered with Apache blood, fenced off watering holes that had been free since the world was young. Coda's own family had not been spared. His father, a respected war chief, had died fighting a cavalry patrol 5 years ago. His younger brother had been killed in a retaliatory raid that accomplished nothing but adding more grief to an already grieving world. The white man's diseases had taken his mother and 2 sisters, their bodies unable to fight sicknesses that the white world had brought to a land that had known different kinds of suffering. Every rational part of his mind told him to ignore the struggling woman below. She was the enemy, part of the wave of invaders who had brought nothing but death and destruction to his people. Her suffering was not his concern, her survival or death a matter of indifference to anyone who understood the true nature of the war being fought in these mountains. But the medallion continued to grow warm, and his grandmother's voice continued to whisper in the wind that rustled through the pines. By October, the nights brought frost that turned the grass white and made the cabin's broken windows seem even more inadequate. Beth had managed to cover the worst gaps with pieces of cloth torn from her spare dress, but the cold still crept in like a living thing, settling into her bones and making sleep a restless, shivering ordeal. The rusted axe head had grown duller with each day's use, its edge chipped and worn despite her attempts to sharpen it with a piece of sandstone she had found near the creek. What had once been difficult work now bordered on the impossible. The blade bounced off hardwood that should have split clean, requiring dozens of blows to accomplish what had once taken 5 or 6. But winter was coming whether she was ready or not, and ready seemed like a distant hope rather than an achievable goal. She needed at least 3 cords of split wood to survive until spring, and her current pace would leave her with barely 1. The mathematics of survival were unforgiving in their simplicity. Not enough wood meant freezing to death, and freezing to death was not an option when she carried another life within her womb. Her body was changing in ways that made the work even more difficult. The baby had begun to move regularly now, small flutters that had grown into definite kicks and rolls that sometimes took her breath away. Her belly seemed to expand daily, throwing off her balance and making it harder to swing the axe with any kind of force or accuracy. The morning she collapsed beside the woodpile, she had been trying to split a particularly stubborn piece of oak for over an hour. The axe bounced off the wood again and again, sending jarring vibrations up her arms and into her shoulders. Sweat poured down her face despite the cold air, and her breath came in ragged gasps that created small clouds in the freezing air. When the contraction hit, it felt like a giant hand squeezing her from the inside out. The axe slipped from her numb fingers, clattering onto the frozen ground as she doubled over in pain. For a terrifying moment she thought the baby was coming early, months before it should arrive. But the pain faded after a minute that felt like an hour, leaving her weak and shaking beside the scattered wood. That's when she saw him. He stood at the edge of the tree line, motionless as a statue carved from bronze and shadow. Even at 50 yards she could see the strength in his lean frame, the way he held himself with the confident stillness of a natural predator. His long black hair hung loose around his shoulders, held back from his face by a band of leather that seemed to catch the weak sunlight. He wore buckskin pants and a shirt that looked soft as silk, both decorated with intricate beadwork that marked him clearly as Apache. Beth's breath caught in her throat, and not from the lingering pain of the contraction. Every story she had ever heard about Apache warriors flooded through her mind, tales of scalping and torture, of settlers found days later in conditions too horrible for civilized conversation. The sensible part of her mind screamed at her to run, to scramble back to the cabin and bar the door, to grab her father's old rifle and prepare to defend herself. But her body would not obey, whether from exhaustion, fear, or some deeper instinct she did not understand. She remained frozen beside the woodpile, staring at the warrior, who stared back with eyes as dark and unreadable as midnight. For a long moment, neither moved. The world seemed to hold its breath around them, the only sound the distant call of a hawk circling overhead, and the soft whisper of wind through the pine needles. Beth could feel her heart hammering against her ribs like a caged bird desperate for freedom. Then, moving with the fluid grace of flowing water, the Apache warrior began walking toward her. Koda had not intended to reveal himself. For 3 weeks, he had maintained his vigil from the safety of the ridge, watching the white woman's struggles from a distance that kept both of them safe from the consequences of contact. His people would not understand his interest in her welfare. Her people would kill him on sight if they discovered his presence near the settlement. But when he saw her collapse beside the woodpile, when he witnessed the obvious pain that bent her double and left her gasping on the frozen ground, something deeper than caution moved him to action. The eagle feather medallion against his chest had grown so warm it almost burned, and his grandmother's voice seemed to whisper directly into his ear. Some debts are owed not to individuals, but to life itself. As he walked across the clearing that separated the forest from the cabin, he kept his hands visible and his movements slow and non-threatening. He had learned enough about white people during his raids and reconnaissance missions to know that they saw Apache warriors as monsters from their darkest nightmares. The woman's terror was evident in every line of her body, in the way she shrank back against the woodpile as if she could somehow disappear into the scattered logs. When he reached the edge of her pitiful pile of split wood, he stopped and slowly raised his right hand, palm open toward her, in the universal gesture of peaceful intent. For a moment he considered attempting to speak in the limited English he had learned from captured settlers and army deserters. But words seemed inadequate for this moment, and he suspected that his harsh accent would only increase her fear. Instead, he knelt beside the scattered logs and began gathering them into a neat pile, his movements deliberate and unhurried. The wood was poorly split, he noticed, the pieces uneven and full of splinters that would burn too fast and produce little heat. The axe head was dull as a butter knife, its edge chipped and worn beyond usefulness. He glanced up at the woman, noting the way she watched his every movement with the intensity of prey, animal calculating its chances of escape. She was younger than he had expected, probably no more than 20, with light brown hair that had escaped from its braid and hung in tangles around a face marked by exhaustion and malnutrition. Her dress, once probably a cheerful blue, had faded to the color of winter sky and bore careful patches at the elbows and knees. But it was her eyes that caught and held his attention. They were the color of spring grass, bright with intelligence and determination. Despite the obvious fear, there was strength in those eyes, a core of steel that had kept her alive and working when lesser souls would have given up and died. Rising to his feet, Koda walked to where the axe lay beside a half-split log. He picked up the tool, testing its weight and balance, frowning at the sorry condition of its edge. Then, with movements practiced from childhood, he positioned himself over the log and brought the axe down in a smooth, powerful arc. The wood split with a clean crack that echoed across the clearing, the two halves falling away cleanly despite the dull blade. He positioned another log and split it just as easily, then another, his movements falling into the rhythm that had been second nature since his grandfather first put an axe in his hands as a boy. Behind him he heard the woman's sharp intake of breath, but he did not look back. Instead, he continued splitting wood with efficient, economical movements, each swing producing results that would have taken her 10 attempts to achieve. When he had reduced the entire pile of unsplit logs to neat stacks of kindling and firewood, he set the axe aside and turned to face her. She had not moved from her position beside the original woodpile, but her expression had changed, from pure terror to a mixture of fear, confusion, and something that might have been gratitude. Koda reached into the small leather pouch that hung from his belt and withdrew a single blue glass bead about the size of a robin's egg, and polished smooth as silk. It was one of many he carried for trading with other tribes, valuable enough to demonstrate serious intent, but not so valuable as to create suspicion about his motives. He placed the bead on top of the neatly stacked firewood, then stepped back and nodded once toward the woman. The message he hoped was clear. This was a gift, not a trap. An offering of help with no immediate expectation of payment or obligation. Without waiting for a response, he turned and walked back toward the tree line, moving with the same unhurried grace that had brought him into the clearing. At the edge of the forest, he paused and looked back. The woman was staring at the blue bead as if it were a diamond fallen from heaven, her green eyes wide with wonder and confusion. Then she looked up and met his gaze across the clearing. For a moment that seemed to stretch like eternity, Apache warrior and white settler regarded each other with something approaching understanding. Whatever this was, whatever it might become, it was no longer a secret that only one of them carried. Koda melted back into the forest, like smoke dispersing in wind, but the warmth of the eagle feather medallion against his chest told him he would be back tomorrow. Beth stared at the blue glass bead until the sun disappeared behind the western mountains and the first stars began to appear in the darkening sky. She had never seen anything quite like it, perfectly round and smooth, the color of summer sky just before dawn, with tiny flecks of silver that seemed to dance in its depths when the light caught it just right. The firewood pile was a miracle of precision and efficiency. Logs that would have taken her hours to split had been reduced to perfect kindling and firewood in less than 30 minutes. The pieces were uniform in size, stacked with mathematical precision, ready to burn clean and hot when winter's worst cold arrives. But it was the bead that held her attention, that small blue sphere that represented something far more significant than its material value. It was a message, though she was not entirely certain what that message might be. A token of peaceful intent, perhaps, or a claim of some kind, marking her and her property as under his protection. The very idea should have terrified her. Apache protection was not something any white settler wanted, not if they hoped to maintain their standing in the community or their safety from other Apache, who might not share this particular warrior's apparently benevolent intention. But as she sat in the gathering darkness, looking at wood that might well mean the difference between surviving the winter and freezing to death, terror was not the emotion that filled her heart. Gratitude was what she felt. Gratitude and a strange sense of hope that she had not experienced since the morning her father cast her out of the only home she had ever known. That night, she burned wood that split cleanly and caught fire immediately, filling the little cabin with more heat than she had felt in weeks. The baby moved restlessly in her womb, as if it too sensed that something fundamental had changed in their small, desperate world. When she woke the next morning, there was fresh meat hanging from a tree branch outside her door. A rabbit, cleaned and ready for cooking, still warm from recent death. No other sign of the Apache warrior's presence, no tracks visible in the hard frozen ground, nothing to indicate he had been there except the gift that meant she would eat well for the first time in days. The pattern continued for a week. Each morning brought some new evidence of his care: split wood when her supply ran low, fresh meat when her hunger grew too sharp to ignore, her broken chimney mysteriously repaired with stones so perfectly fitted that no mortar was needed to hold them in place. He never approached during the day, never made himself visible when she might see him. But she knew he was watching, knew he was there like a guardian spirit that asked nothing and gave everything. Her fear gradually gave way to curiosity, then to a strange sort of companionship with this invisible protector. On the 8th morning she left her own gift beside the woodpile, a small loaf of bread she had baked from her dwindling supply of flour, still warm from the oven, and wrapped in a clean cloth. By evening it was gone, replaced by a small wooden bowl carved from pine and polished to a satin smoothness that spoke of hours of careful work. The bowl was beautiful in its simplicity, perfectly proportioned and decorated with a subtle pattern of leaves and vines that seemed to flow around its circumference like living things. But more than its beauty, it was the thought behind it that moved her to tears. Someone cared enough to spend hours creating something lovely for her, someone who owed her nothing and gained nothing from her welfare, except perhaps the satisfaction of a good deed performed. That night, for the first time since leaving her father's house, Sarah Beth slept deeply and without dreams of cold or hunger or loneliness. The early winter storm struck on a Tuesday morning in late November, arriving with the sudden ferocity that marked weather in the high desert. Sarah Beth woke to the sound of wind howling around the cabin like a living thing, rattling the windows and sending fingers of cold air through every crack and gap in the old building's defenses. By noon, snow was falling so heavily that she could barely see the woodpile from the cabin's single window. The temperature dropped so quickly that ice formed on the inside of the glass, creating crystalline patterns that would have been beautiful if they had not represented such immediate danger. She fed the fire constantly, burning wood faster than she had planned, but the heat seemed to leak out of the cabin as quickly as she could generate it. The baby had been unusually quiet all morning, a stillness that worried her more than the storm itself. Cold could kill an unborn child as surely as it could kill the mother, and she was not certain how much cold either of them could endure. By mid-afternoon, despite her efforts to conserve fuel, she was down to her last few pieces of split wood. The storm showed no signs of lessening, and venturing outside to gather more wood was not an option. She could barely see her own hand in the swirling snow, and the wind was strong enough to knock her down and bury her in minutes. As darkness approached and the last logs settled into coals in the fireplace, Sarah Beth wrapped herself in both of her blankets and prepared to face what might be her final night. The baby stirred restlessly, as if sensing her fear, and she placed both hands over her swollen belly in a futile gesture of protection. That's when she heard the sound of footsteps on the cabin's small porch. Through the howling wind came 3 distinct knocks on her door, firm, deliberate, impossible to mistake for the random noise of the storm. Sarah Beth's heart hammered as she approached the door, knowing that no white person would be traveling in such weather, knowing that only one person had reason to be outside her cabin on a night like this. "It's me," came a deep voice from the other side of the door, the words heavily accented but clearly spoken. "I have wood." She lifted the wooden bar that secured the door and pulled it open, immediately struck by a blast of snow-laden wind that nearly knocked her backward. The Apache warrior stood on her porch, his hair and clothing dusted with snow, carrying an armload of split wood, that looked impossibly dry despite the storm. Without invitation, he stepped inside and moved directly to the fireplace, stacking the wood beside the dying coals with practiced efficiency. Sarah Beth closed the door behind him and replaced the bar, her hands shaking from cold and something that was not quite fear. In the confined space of the cabin, he seemed larger than she remembered, his presence filling the small room in a way that had nothing to do with physical size. But there was nothing threatening in his manner as he knelt beside the fireplace and began building up the fire with swift, sure movements. Within minutes, flames were dancing high in the grate, throwing warmth and golden light throughout the cabin. He stood and turned toward her, his dark eyes meeting hers directly for the first time since that first day beside the woodpile. "Storm bad," he said, his English rough but understandable. "You need help." Sarah Beth nodded, not trusting her voice. The relief of warmth returning to the cabin was overwhelming, but it was more than that. For the first time in months, she was not alone with her fears and her burdens. Someone else was sharing this space. Someone strong enough to fight the storm that had nearly defeated her. "Thank you," she managed to whisper. He reached into a leather pack she had not noticed before and withdrew a woven blanket, unlike anything she had ever seen. It was made from some kind of incredibly soft wool, dyed in shades of red and gold and deep brown, with patterns that seemed to tell stories she could not read but somehow understood. "Apache women make," he said, offering her the blanket. "Very warm. For babe." The kindness in the gesture broke something loose inside her chest. She accepted the blanket with hands that trembled, not from cold but from emotions too complex to name. The wool was indeed incredibly warm, and as she wrapped it around her shoulders, she felt the baby respond with a series of gentle movements that seemed almost like contentment. "What is your name?" she asked, the question emerging before she could consider whether it was appropriate or safe. He considered for a moment, as if weighing the significance of sharing that information with her. "Coda," he said finally, "mean friend in my language. I'm Sarah Beth." She paused, then added, "It means princess in Hebrew." Smile flickered across his face, the first she had seen from him, and it transformed his features from stern to almost gentle. "Princess who chops wood and makes bread. Good prince." Despite everything, the storm, the circumstances, the impossibility of their situation, Sarah Beth found herself laughing. It was a rusty sound, unused for so long that it seemed foreign to her own ears, but it felt wonderful to have a reason for laughter again. They spent the evening in careful conversation, his broken English and her patient listening gradually building bridges across the vast cultural divide that separated their worlds. He told her about his people's ways, about the seasons of hunting and gathering that had sustained the Apache for countless generations. She shared memories of her childhood, of the father who had taught her to read, and the mother who had shown her how to bake bread that rose light and sweet. Neither spoke of the war that raged between their peoples, of the raids and reprisals that had claimed so many lives on both sides. For this one night, trapped together by the storm, they were simply two people sharing warmth and companionship against the hostile forces of nature. When the baby moved strongly enough to make her gasp, Coda's eyes immediately went to her belly with an expression of wonder and concern. "Baby strong," he observed. "Fights like Apache warrior." Sarah Beth placed her hand over the spot where tiny feet seemed to be practicing kicks. "He or she certainly has an active schedule, especially when I'm trying to sleep. In my tribe, babies who move much in mother's belly become great leaders. Strong spirit, strong will." The words were meant as comfort, she realized. His attempt to reassure her that her child was healthy and normal despite the difficult circumstances of its conception and the hardships she had endured. Coming from him, from someone whose people revered children as sacred gifts, the observation carried weight that similar words from a white doctor could not have matched. As the night deepened and the storm continued its assault on the cabin, they settled into a comfortable silence. Sarah Beth dozed fitfully in the single chair, wrapped in the warm Apache blanket, while Coda kept watch by the fire, feeding it regularly and ensuring that the life-giving warmth never faltered. She woke near dawn to find him preparing to leave, the storm having finally blown itself out during the night. Sunlight streamed through the windows, revealing a world transformed by snow into something beautiful and pristine. "Storm over," he said simply. "You safe now." But as he prepared to step back out into the world where Apache warriors and white settlers were enemies by definition, Sarah Beth felt a panic that had nothing to do with cold or hunger or physical danger. "Will I see you again?" she asked, the words emerging before she could stop them. Coda paused in the doorway, looking back at her with an expression she could not quite read. "Maybe," he said. "If you need help," then he was gone, leaving behind only the scent of wood smoke and leather, and the warmth of the blanket that had sheltered her through the longest night of her life. But something had changed during those hours they had shared. The invisible wall that had existed between them had crumbled, replaced by something Sarah Beth was not yet ready to name, but could no longer deny. She was falling in love with an Apache warrior, and she suspected he might be falling in love with her too. The brass military button gleamed dully in the morning sun, half buried in the mud beside Sarah Beth's cabin, where the snow had melted into small rivulets that carved temporary channels in the hard ground. She almost missed it during her morning check of the woodpile, her attention focused on calculating how many days her current supply might last. But the metallic glint caught her eye, and she knelt to examine what at first appeared to be just another piece of debris left behind by the cabin's previous occupants. The button bore the distinctive eagle and shield design of the U Army, its brass surface tarnished green but still clearly identifiable as military issue. More troubling still, it looked relatively fresh, not the kind of artifact that would have survived years of weather exposure. Someone wearing a military uniform had been near her cabin recently, close enough to lose a button from their coat or shirt. Sarah Beth felt a cold dread settle in her stomach that had nothing to do with the morning air. Military presence in this area could mean only one thing. Someone had reported suspicious activity, possibly Apache activity, in the vicinity of her cabin. The army would investigate any such reports with the thoroughness and ruthlessness that had characterized their approach to what they euphemistically called the Indian problem. She glanced toward the tree line where she knew Coda often watched from concealment, wondering if he was there now, if he had seen whatever soldier had dropped this button. The implications were terrifying for both of them. If the army suspected that Apache warriors were operating in this area, they would increase patrols and establish a more permanent presence. Discovery would mean death for Coda, and disgrace for her, assuming she survived the scandal of having consorted with the enemy. That afternoon, as she worked at mending her increasingly threadbare clothing, Sarah Beth noticed riders approaching from the direction of town. 3 men on horseback, moving with the purposeful pace of people on official business. She recognized 2 of them immediately: Sheriff Coleman, a thin man with prematurely gray hair and the kind of rigid righteousness that made him feared rather than respected, and his deputy, young Bill Harrison, who had courted her briefly before Thomas Garrett's arrival had ended that possibility. The third man was a stranger, but his bearing and dress marked him clearly as military. He wore the blue uniform of a cavalry officer, his brass buttons gleaming in the afternoon sun, buttons identical to the one she had found that morning. Sarah Beth set aside her sewing and walked to the cabin door, her heart hammering with the kind of fear that came from knowing your secrets might be about to become public knowledge. She opened the door before they could knock, hoping to appear cooperative and unsuspicious. "Miss Whitmore," Sheriff Coleman said, touching the brim of his hat with mock politeness. "This here is Lieutenant Morrison from Fort Apache. He'd like to ask you a few questions." Lieutenant Morrison was a young man, probably no more than 25, with the kind of clean-shaven earnestness that suggested recent graduation from West Point and limited experience with the realities of frontier warfare. He dismounted from his horse with military precision, and approached the cabin with the careful attention of someone trained to notice details. "Miss Whitmore, we've received reports of Apache sign in this area, tracks, evidence of hunting, that sort of thing. Have you noticed anything unusual recently?" Sarah Beth forced herself to meet his gaze directly, knowing that any sign of deception would confirm whatever suspicions had brought them here. "I see tracks sometimes," she said carefully. "Deer, elk, occasionally a bear, but I wouldn't know Apache tracks from any other kind, to be honest." "What about gifts?" Deputy Harrison spoke for the first time, his voice carrying a personal edge that made Sarah Beth's skin crawl. "Anyone leaving you presents? Food, maybe, or firewood?" The question was too specific, too pointed to be casual curiosity. Someone had been watching her, had noticed the improvements to her situation that she could not reasonably have accomplished alone. Sarah Beth felt the walls of her carefully constructed privacy beginning to crumble. "I've been managing on my own," she said, hoping the half-truth would satisfy them. "Learning as I go." Lieutenant Morrison walked around the cabin's perimeter, his trained eyes taking in details that probably told him far more than Sarah Beth wanted him to know. The precisely split firewood, stacked with military efficiency, the repaired chimney, its stones fitted with a skill that suggested extensive experience with masonry. The absence of the kinds of mistakes and debris that typically marked the work of an inexperienced woman living alone. "Mighty fine woodwork," he observed, running his hand along the edge of the woodpile. "Clean splits, uniform size, takes considerable skill to achieve this kind of quality." "I'm learning," Sarah Beth repeated, but she could hear the weakness in her own voice. Sheriff Coleman dismounted and approached the cabin's front door, his attention focused on something Sarah Beth could not see. "Lieutenant, you might want to take a look at this." The three men gathered around the doorframe, examining what Sarah Beth realized with growing horror was probably a moccasin print in the soft earth beside her steps. Despite Coda's careful attention to concealing his visits, the storm and subsequent snowmelt had revealed evidence that no amount of caution could completely eliminate. "That's Apache, all right," Lieutenant Morrison said grimly. "Fresh, probably within the last few days. Miss Whitmore, I need you to understand the seriousness of this situation. If Apache warriors are operating in this area, your life is in considerable danger." "I haven't seen any Indians," Sarah Beth said, the lie burning her throat like acid. "Maybe not," Deputy Harrison said with a knowing smirk. "But maybe they've seen you. Maybe they've decided you're worth keeping alive for reasons I don't care to mention in polite company." The implication hung in the air like smoke from a poorly tended fire. Sarah Beth felt heat rise in her cheeks, understanding perfectly what Harrison was suggesting and knowing that her reaction was probably confirming his suspicions. "That's enough, Bill," Sheriff Coleman said sharply, but his eyes remained fixed on Sarah Beth's face. "Miss Whitmore, we're going to recommend that you consider returning to town until we can clear this area of hostiles. It's not safe for a woman alone out here, especially in your condition." Her condition, the words carried judgment and speculation that made her stomach turn. They knew about the baby, had probably known all along, and now they were drawing their own conclusions about why an Apache warrior might take interest in a pregnant white woman living alone. "I appreciate your concern," she said, fighting to keep her voice level, "but I'm managing fine on my own." Lieutenant Morrison stepped closer, his young face earnest with what he probably believed was protective concern. "Miss, you don't understand what these savages are capable of. The things we've seen at other homesteads." He paused, apparently reconsidering his words in deference to her delicate condition. "Let's just say that Apache warriors don't make distinctions between combatants and civilians." After they left, riding back toward town with promises to increase patrols in the area, Sarah Beth sat in her cabin and stared at the brass button she had hidden in her pocket. The weight of it seemed enormous, a small piece of metal that represented the crushing force of two worlds preparing for collision. That evening she walked to the edge of the clearing and called softly into the gathering darkness, using the name he had given her. "Code, if you're out there, I need to speak with you." He emerged from the shadows like a spirit materializing from the spirit world, his face grave with the knowledge that their secret was no longer secret. In his hand, he carried a small piece of cloth, blue fabric torn from a cavalry uniform, probably snagged on a branch during the soldiers' reconnaissance of her property. "They know," he said simply. "They suspect," Sarah Beth corrected. "But suspicion isn't proof." Coda's dark eyes met hers with an intensity that made her breath catch. In white man's world, suspicion enough for hanging rope. The truth of his words settled between them like a stone dropped into still water. Sarah Beth understood the mathematics of their situation with crystalline clarity. Her association with an Apache warrior, willing or unwilling, would mark her as a traitor to her own people. His protection of a white woman, no matter how innocent his motives, would be seen as either weakness or treachery by his tribe. "You should go," she whispered, hating the words even as she spoke them. "Return to your people. Pretend this never happened. Cannot." The single word carried the weight of absolute conviction. "Eagle feather grows warm when I think of leaving. Grandmother's spirit says debt, not finished." "What debt? You don't owe me anything." Coda moved closer, and in the fading light, Sarah Beth could see something in his expression that made her heart race with more than fear. "Not debt to you. Debt to life itself. To child who comes. To something bigger than Apache, bigger than white man." His words hung in the evening air like prophecy, speaking to truth that neither of them fully understood, but both felt in their bones. Whatever was happening between them had moved beyond simple kindness or even physical attraction. It had become something that demanded acknowledgement, even if that acknowledgement came with consequences neither of them was prepared to face. "They'll come back," Sarah Beth said. "With more men, more questions. They'll watch this place." "Yes, and when they do, we must be ready." "Ready for what?" Coda's smile was grim, but determined. Ready to choose. The choice, when it came, arrived sooner than either of them expected. 2 days later, Sarah Beth woke to the sound of horses approaching at a gallop, the urgent rhythm of hoofbeats that suggested trouble rather than casual visit. Through her window, she could see a cloud of dust on the horizon, moving fast toward her cabin. She had perhaps 5 minutes before they arrived, 5 minutes to decide whether to maintain her fiction of innocence or acknowledge the truth that everyone already suspected. The decision, when it came, surprised her with its simplicity. Walking to the cabin door, she opened it wide and stepped onto the small porch, one hand resting on her swollen belly in a gesture that was both protective and defiant. When Sheriff Coleman and his enlarged posse rode into her clearing, they found her waiting for them with the dignity of someone who had nothing left to lose. "Miss Whitmore," the sheriff called as he reined in his horse, "we need you to come with us, for your own account." "And if I refuse?" Lieutenant Morrison, who had returned with reinforcements, urged his mount forward. "Then we'll be forced to consider other possibilities about your situation out here." The threat was clear, delivered with the casual authority of someone accustomed to having his orders obeyed without question. Sarah Beth looked at the faces of the men surrounding her cabin, some familiar from town, others wearing the hard expressions of professional soldiers, and understood that her time for choosing had run out. "I'll need to pack a few things," she said. "You have 5 minutes," Coleman replied. "And Miss Whitmore, don't even think about trying to signal your Apache friends. We've got sharpshooters positioned in the tree line." As she gathered her few possessions, Sarah Beth wondered if Coda was out there watching, if he understood that this forced departure might be their last goodbye. The silver locket her mother had given her seemed to grow heavy around her neck, its weight a reminder of all the connections she was about to sever. But as she emerged from the cabin with her small bundle of belongings, she felt something that surprised her with its strength. Not despair or defeat, but a kind of fierce resolve that seemed to come from the child growing within her womb. Whatever happened next, Whoever she had been before this moment, she was finished with being a victim of other people's decisions. When Lieutenant Morrison helped her onto the spare horse they had brought, his touch was impersonal, but not unkind. "You're doing the right thing, miss," he said quietly. "Those savages would have killed you eventually, no matter what hold they seemed to have over you." Sarah Beth said nothing, but her silence carried its own message. As the posse rode toward town with her in their protective custody, she turned once to look back at the cabin that had been her refuge and prison, her school and her sanctuary. From the ridge above the clearing, barely visible against the dark line of pine trees, a lone figure watched their departure. Even at that distance, Sarah Beth could feel the intensity of Coda's gaze, could sense the weight of promises unspoken and choices yet to be made. This was not an ending, she realized. It was a transformation, the moment when two people from different worlds stopped pretending they could exist in the comfortable space between their cultures and acknowledged that some bridges, once built, could never be unbuilt. The town of Cedar Ridge had grown around the inevitable human needs of frontier life: a general store, a saloon, a church, a jail, and a scattering of houses that represented the thin line between civilization and wilderness. Sarah Beth had not been back since the day she had left her father's house in shame and exile, and her return under military escort drew the kind of attention she had hoped never to face again. They installed her in a room above the general store, with Deputy Harrison stationed outside her door and strict instructions that she was not to leave without escort. The room was small but clean, with a single window that looked out over the main street and provided a view of the comings and goings of a community that had already begun to whisper about her situation. Miss Patterson, the store owner's wife, brought her meals and clean linens with a kind of Christian charity that managed to be both helpful and judgmental in equal measure. "Poor dear," she would murmur, her eyes fixed on Sarah Beth's swollen belly. "Taken in by those savages, no doubt used in ways too terrible to mention. But you're safe now, among civilized folks." The assumption that she had been a captive rather than a willing participant in whatever relationship they imagined stung more than direct accusations might have. It reduced her to a victim without agency, someone who had suffered rather than someone who had chosen, and it made the growing life within her womb seem like evidence of violation, rather than the result of her own decisions. On her third night in town, Sarah Beth was awakened by the sound of gunfire from the direction of her abandoned cabin. The shots echoed across the valley in rapid succession, the sharp crack of military rifles answered by the deeper boom of hunting weapons. The battle, if it was a battle, lasted less than 10 minutes before silence returned to the mountain darkness. Lieutenant Morrison arrived at her door the next morning, his young face grim with the kind of news that no one wanted to deliver. "I'm afraid there was an incident last night. Apache warriors attempted to attack your former residence. We were ready for them. Was anyone hurt?" Sarah Beth asked, her voice carefully neutral despite the fear that was clawing at her chest. "Two of theirs down, according to the blood trail we followed this morning. None of our boys were touched. Looks like they were planning to rescue you, thinking you were still at the cabin." He paused, studying her face for signs of reaction. "Funny thing, though, one of the warriors matched the description of someone we've been tracking for months. Big fellow, skilled tracker, known to be particularly dangerous." Sarah Beth felt the world tilt sideways around her. "Did you capture him?" "No, unfortunately, but if he was wounded, he won't get far in this terrain. We'll find him eventually." After Morrison left, Sarah Beth sat by her small window and stared out at the mountains where Coda might be bleeding, might be dying, might already be dead. The possibility that her forced rescue had led directly to his injury or death was almost too horrible to contemplate. But as the day wore on and no further news came from the military patrols, she found herself clinging to a hope that had no rational foundation. Coda was Apache, trained from childhood in survival skills that white soldiers could barely comprehend. If anyone could disappear into the wilderness and heal from wounds that would kill an ordinary man, it would be him. That night, She lay awake listening to the sounds of the town settling into sleep around her. The closing of shop doors, the final conversations of men leaving the saloon, the bark of dogs, and the cry of night birds. But underneath these familiar sounds, she imagined she could hear something else. The whisper of moccasins on hard ground, the soft call that might be a night bird or might be something else entirely. When she woke the next morning, there was a small piece of carved wood on her windowsill, a tiny eagle no bigger than her thumb, its wings spread as if in flight. The carving was unmistakably Apache in style, created with the kind of skill that turned simple wood into something that seemed almost alive. The message was clear. Coda had survived, and he had found a way to let her know. But more than that, the carved eagle represented a promise, a commitment that their story was far from over, despite the forces arrayed against them. Sarah Beth closed her fingers around the small carving and felt the baby move strongly within her womb, as if responding to her sudden surge of hope and determination. Whatever came next, wherever this path led them, she would face it with the strength that came from knowing she was not alone. The decision to escape came to her, not as a sudden inspiration, but as the inevitable conclusion to days of careful observation and planning. Sarah Beth had spent her time in protective custody studying the rhythms of the town, learning the schedules of her guards, noting the moments when attention was focused elsewhere. Deputy Harrison was conscientious but predictable, making his rounds every 2 hours with the mechanical precision of someone following orders, rather than thinking strategically. The night patrol changed guards at midnight, creating a 15-minute window when the back alley behind the general store was unwatched. Mrs. Patterson retired early and slept soundly, her room at the front of the building too far away to hear quiet movement on the back stairs. The plan, when she finally committed to it, was simple in the way that desperate plans often were. On Thursday night, when the moon was dark and the November cold would keep most people indoors, she would slip out through the back window, make her way to the stable where the horses were kept, and ride toward the mountains where Coda was presumably hiding and healing from his wound. It was not a plan with a high probability of success. She was nearly 7 months pregnant, unfamiliar with the mountain trails, and possessed of only rudimentary riding skill. If Coda was seriously injured or had moved to a location she could not find, she would likely die of exposure in the wilderness. If she was caught in the attempt, she would face consequences that could include imprisonment or worse, but staying in town meant accepting a future that had been chosen for her by other people, a life of whispered speculation and charitable condescension that would extend to her child. The baby growing within her womb deserved better than to be raised as the bastard offspring of a woman who had consorted with savages, marked from birth by the circumstances of its conception. On Thursday evening, Sarah Beth lay in her narrow bed and listened to the sounds of the town settling into its nightly routine. When Deputy Harrison made his 10 o'clock rounds, she was apparently sleeping peacefully, her breathing deep and regular beneath the thin blankets. When he returned at midnight, the shape in the bed still appeared undisturbed, the carefully arranged pillows and blankets maintaining the illusion of occupancy. By then, Sarah Beth was already 2 miles outside of town, riding a borrowed horse along a creek bed that would conceal her tracks from casual pursuit. The cold cut through her inadequate clothing like knives, and the baby's movements seemed more restless than usual, as if responding to her elevated heart rate and the stress of their midnight journey. She had taken the carved eagle from her windowsill, and now it rested in her coat pocket like a talisman, its tiny wooden form warming under her palm as she urged the horse toward the mountains, where instinct rather than knowledge told her Coda might be waiting. The tracking stone lay beside a small spring about 5 miles from town, partially hidden beneath a fallen log, in a way that would be invisible to white eyes, but obvious to someone who knew how to read Apache sign. Sarah Beth almost missed it, her attention focused on the difficult task of navigating unfamiliar terrain in near total darkness, but the horse shied away from the log, as if sensing something significant. The stone was smooth river rock, marked with symbols that meant nothing to her, but everything to someone with the proper knowledge. She had no idea what the marks indicated, but their presence confirmed that she was on the right track, that Coda had indeed passed this way and left messages for anyone with the skill to interpret them. Following the creek bed higher into the mountains, she found 2 more marked stones over the next 3 hours, each one guiding her deeper into terrain that grew increasingly rugged and forbidding. The baby had grown quiet, either settling into sleep or conserving energy for the ordeal ahead, and Sarah Beth found herself talking to the child in whispers that she hoped would provide comfort for them both. "Almost there, little one," she murmured, as the horse picked its way carefully along a narrow trail that switchbacked up the side of a steep canyon. "Just a little farther, and we'll find somewhere safe." Dawn was breaking over the eastern peaks when she finally saw the thin column of smoke rising from a sheltered canyon ahead, so faint that it was almost invisible against the grey morning sky. Her heart hammered with a mixture of hope and fear as she urged the tired horse toward what might be sanctuary or might be disaster. The Apache camp was hidden in a box canyon that would have been invisible from any direction except the narrow entrance she had just traversed. 3 men sat around a small fire, their faces turning toward her with expressions that ranged from surprise to suspicion to something that might have been recognition. Coda rose slowly from his position beside the fire, and Sarah Beth could see the careful way he moved, the evidence of recent injury in the stiffness of his posture and the pale cast of his normally bronze skin. But he was alive, unmistakably and gloriously alive, and the relief that flooded through her was so intense that she nearly fell from the horse. "Sarah Beth," he said, his voice carrying a mixture of joy and concern that made her heart race. "You should not have come." "I had to," she replied, sliding awkwardly from the saddle with one hand pressed to her aching back. "They were going to keep me prisoner in town, raise my child to be ashamed of everything that brought us together." The other 2 Apache warriors watched this exchange with expressions that Sarah Beth could not read, their dark eyes moving between her and Coda with the intensity of people making calculations about loyalty and risk. She recognized one of them as younger, perhaps Coda's age, with the kind of restless energy that suggested a warrior in his prime. The other was older, his hair streaked with silver and his face marked by the kind of deep lines that came from a lifetime of difficult decisions. Coda spoke to them in rapid Apache, his words carrying the tone of explanation, or perhaps argument. The older warrior responded with what sounded like questions, his gaze never leaving Sarah Beth's face as he evaluated this unexpected complication to whatever plans they had been making. Finally, the older warrior rose and approached Sarah Beth with the measured dignity of someone accustomed to command. When he spoke, his English was better than Coda's, though still heavily accented. "I am Nalnish," he said, "Coda's uncle, brother to his dead father. You bring danger to our people." "I bring only myself and my child," Sarah Beth replied, meeting his gaze directly despite the intimidation she felt. "I ask for nothing except the chance to be with the man I love." Nalnish's eyebrows rose slightly at her directness, but his expression remained stern. "Love between Apache and white woman brings death to both peoples. Soldiers will come looking for you. They will bring more soldiers, more weapons, more hatred." "The soldiers were already coming," Sarah Beth said. "My being here changes nothing except that I won't be their excuse for attacking your people." The older warrior studied her for a long moment, his eyes taking in her obvious pregnancy, her travel-stained clothing, the exhaustion that was making it difficult for her to remain standing. Whatever he saw seemed to soften his expression slightly. "You are brave, white woman, foolish, but brave." He glanced at Coda, who was watching the conversation with obvious anxiety, "and my nephew's heart is written on his face for anyone with eyes to see." Nalnish spoke again in Apache, this time at greater length, his words carrying the weight of decision rather than discussion. Coda responded with obvious relief, then hurried to Sarah Beth's side as her knees began to buckle from exhaustion and delayed reaction. "Uncle says you may stay," he told her as he helped her to a seat beside the fire. "But we cannot remain here long. Too close to town, too easy for soldiers to find." "Where will we go?" "South," Coda replied, to Mexico, where Apache and white can marry without soldiers coming to kill them. The word marry hung in the cold mountain air like a promise and a question rolled into one. Sarah Beth looked into Coda's dark eyes and saw her future reflected. They're uncertain, dangerous, but filled with a love that had already proven stronger than the hatred that divided their peoples. "Is that what you want?" she asked quietly. "To marry me despite everything it will cost us?" Coda's smile was the first completely unguarded expression she had ever seen from him, transforming his face from stern warrior to young man in love. "Want it more than breath, more than water, more than anything in this world or next." The baby chose that moment to kick strongly enough to make Sarah Beth gasp, as if adding its own voice to the conversation. Around them, the mountains stood silent and eternal, witness to a love story that defied every convention of their time and place. In 3 days, when Sarah Beth's strength had returned and Nalnish's scouts had found a safe route south, they would begin the dangerous journey toward a new life in Mexico. But for now, in this hidden canyon with the man she loved and the child they would raise together, Sarah Beth allowed herself to believe that love could indeed conquer the forces arrayed against it. The contractions began at dawn on the second day of their journey toward Mexico, starting as a dull ache in Sarah Beth's lower back that she initially attributed to the rigors of riding horseback across rough terrain while heavily pregnant. By mid-morning, as they followed a narrow game trail through dense forest, the pain had intensified to the point where she could no longer hide her discomfort from the 3 Apache warriors who served as her protectors and guides. Coda noticed first, his trained eye catching the way she gripped the saddle horn during the increasingly frequent waves of pain, the careful way she breathed through each episode. When she doubled over during a particularly strong contraction, he called an immediate halt to their progress. "Baby comes," he announced grimly, his English reduced to essentials by stress and urgency. "Need safe place, need help." Nalnish studied the terrain around them with the tactical awareness of a warrior who had survived countless dangerous situations by making quick, correct decisions. They were in a narrow valley between 2 ridges, exposed to observation from above, and with limited escape routes if they were discovered by pursuing soldiers. "There," he said, pointing toward a cluster of large boulders about a quarter-mile ahead. "Natural shelter, hidden from view, near water source." The younger warrior, whose name Sarah Beth had learned was Chateau, rode ahead to scout the location, while Coda helped her dismount from her horse. The contractions were coming every few minutes now, strong enough to take her breath away and leave her trembling in their aftermath. "Too early," she gasped, as another wave of pain peaked and slowly subsided. "Baby not supposed to come for another month." Coda's face was grim with worry, but his voice remained calm and reassuring. "Apache baby strong. Come when ready, not when white man's calendar says." The shelter Nalish had spotted proved to be a natural cave formed by several massive boulders leaning against each other, creating a space large enough for several people, but completely concealed from outside observation. A small stream provided fresh water, and the sandy floor could be made comfortable with the blankets they carried. As Coda and Chateau prepared the makeshift birthing chamber, Nalish approached Sarah Beth with the grave expression of someone about to share difficult news. "White woman, I must tell you truth. I have helped Apache women birth many babies, but never white woman. Your people may be different. If something goes wrong, nothing will go wrong," Sarah Beth said with more confidence than she felt. "This baby was conceived in love and protected by spirits. It will be born healthy and strong." Her certainty was rewarded by a smile from the older warrior, the first she had seen from him since their first meeting. Spoken like true Apache woman, "We will help bring your child into world safely." The labor progressed quickly, as if the baby had indeed decided it was ready to be born regardless of calendars or convenient timing. Within the protected circle of their rock shelter, attended by 3 Apache warriors who treated the birth as both sacred ritual and practical necessity, Sarah Beth found herself drawing on reserves of strength she had never known she possessed. Coda never left her side, his strong hands supporting her when she needed to move, his voice offering encouragement in a mixture of Apache and English that somehow made perfect sense to her in the moment. Nalnish prepared traditional birthing cords and cloths, while Chateau maintained watch and tended a small fire that provided warmth without creating telltale smoke. When the final stage of labor arrived, Sarah Beth found herself surrounded by a strength and competence that had nothing to do with formal medical training and everything to do with the accumulated wisdom of a people who had been successfully bringing children into the world for countless generations. "Baby crowning, Coda," announced, his voice tight with emotion. "Almost here, almost ready." The pain reached a crescendo that seemed to consume her entire being. And then suddenly it was over, replaced by the thin, indignant cry of a newborn child taking its first breath. Through tears of exhaustion and joy, Sarah Beth watched as Coda lifted their baby with hands that trembled slightly despite their obvious competence. "Girl," he announced, his voice breaking with wonder. "Perfect Apache princess." The baby was indeed perfect, small but completely formed, with dark hair that would probably lighten to brown, and skin that carried hints of both her parents' heritage. As Coda placed the infant on Sarah Beth's chest, she felt a completion that went beyond simple maternal satisfaction. This child represented the physical embodiment of love that had transcended the boundaries others tried to impose, a living bridge between two worlds. Nalnish performed the traditional ceremonies that welcomed Apache children into the tribe, speaking prayers in his native language, while tying the birthing cord with intricate knots that he explained would protect the child throughout its life. The rituals were foreign to Sarah Beth's Christian upbringing, but they felt right in ways that had nothing to do with theological doctrine and everything to do with the sacred nature of new life entering the world. As the sun set over the mountains and their small group settled in for the night, Sarah Beth nursed her daughter while Coda sat beside them with an expression of protective tenderness that made her heart overflow with love. Outside their shelter, Chateau maintained watch while Nalnish prepared a meal from their limited supplies. "What will we call her?" Sarah Beth asked quietly, studying the tiny face that already seemed to show hints of both parents' features. Coda considered the question with the seriousness it deserved. "Apache name or white name?" "Both. She belongs to both worlds, deserves names from both peoples." "White name you choose," he said. "Apache name." He paused, studying their daughter's face with the intensity of someone reading important signs. "Ayanna means eternal blossom, something that grows beautiful and never dies." "Ayanna," Sarah Beth repeated, testing the sound of it. "And for the white world, I think hope, because she represents hope for something better between our peoples." "Hope." Ayanna, a name that carried the weight of two cultures and the promise of a future neither parent could fully imagine, but both were committed to creating. As the baby settled into sleep in her mother's arms, the small family found themselves facing an uncertain future with the confidence that came from having already overcome odds that most people would have considered impossible. Tomorrow they would continue their journey toward Mexico and the possibility of a life where their love could exist openly. But tonight, in a hidden cave in the Arizona mountains, they were simply a family welcoming its newest member into a world that was about to become a little more complicated and a lot more beautiful. The Apache village appeared in the dawn mist, like something from a dream, its traditional wickiups and more recent army surplus tents, arranged in the kind of defensive pattern that spoke of a people who had learned to be ready for anything. Sarah Beth rode into the camp, holding her 3-day-old daughter, while Coda walked beside her horse, his hand resting protectively on her knee, as dozens of dark eyes watched their approach, with expressions that ranged from curious to hostile. Nalnish had sent Chateau ahead with word of their arrival, and the tribal council was already gathered around a central fire when their small party reached the heart of the village. Sarah Beth counted at least 20 adults, ranging from young warriors to elderly women, whose weathered faces spoke of lifetimes spent surviving in harsh country under increasingly difficult circumstances. The silence that greeted them was not entirely unfriendly, but it carried weight that made Sarah Beth acutely aware of her status as an outsider in a community that had every reason to distrust white people. She dismounted carefully, still sore from the birth, and stood beside Coda with their daughter in her arms while he spoke to the assembled crowd in rapid Apache. An elderly woman rose from her seat beside the fire and approached them with the measured dignity of someone accustomed to being obeyed without question. Her hair was silver white and braided with small ornaments that caught the morning light, and her dark eyes held the kind of wisdom that came from having lived through more changes and challenges than most people could survive. "I am Desba," she said in careful English, "grandmother to Coda, keeper of old ways for our people. You bring white child to Apache village. This is unusual." Sarah Beth met the older woman's gaze directly, understanding that this moment would determine whether she and her daughter would find acceptance or face rejection from the only community that might offer them sanctuary. "I bring my daughter to her father's people," she replied. "I ask only for the chance to raise her among those who will teach her to be proud of all parts of her heritage." Desba studied the baby in Sarah Beth's arms, her expression softening slightly as she took in the infant's peaceful sleep and the obvious health that marked her as having been born into love rather than violence. "Child is beautiful, has strong spirit, like her father." She paused, glancing at Coda with an expression that mixed pride and concern. "But white woman in Apache village brings danger. Soldiers will come looking." "Soldiers were already looking," Sarah Beth said. "My presence here changes nothing, except that I won't be their prisoner when they come." A younger warrior spoke sharply in Apache, his tone suggesting disagreement or challenge. Coda responded with equal intensity, and soon several voices were engaged in what sounded like heated debate. Sarah Beth couldn't understand the words, but the emotional undertones were clear enough: fear, anger, protectiveness, and underneath it all, a deep weariness with the endless cycle of violence that had consumed so many lives on both sides. Desba raised her hand for silence, and the arguing voices immediately stilled. When she spoke, her words carried the authority of someone whose decisions were not subject to appeal. "White woman will stay," she announced in English, apparently for Sarah Beth's benefit. "Child is Apache blood, belongs with Apache people. Mother belongs where child belongs." She fixed Sarah Beth with a stare that seemed to look directly into her soul. "But you must learn our ways, speak our language, become more than just white woman living among Indians." Over the following weeks, Sarah Beth threw herself into the task of learning Apache customs and language with the intensity of someone whose survival depended on successful integration. The women of the village became her teachers, showing her how to prepare traditional foods, how to work hides into soft leather, how to weave baskets with patterns that told stories of the people's history and beliefs. The language came slowly at first, its complex grammar and unfamiliar sounds challenging her in ways that English had never prepared her for. But gradually, as she spent hours each day listening and practicing, the Apache words began to make sense, their meanings connecting to concepts and experiences that had no equivalent in the white world. Little Hope, or Ayanna, as she was known in the village, thrived in the communal environment of Apache child rearing. She was passed from woman to woman throughout the day, receiving attention and care from multiple mothers who treated her not as a half-breed outsider, but as a precious addition to the tribe's next generation. Coda's status within the community seemed to grow rather than diminish as a result of his relationship with Sarah Beth. His willingness to take responsibility for a white woman and mixed-race child was seen by many as evidence of strength rather than weakness, proof that he was capable of making difficult decisions and standing by them regardless of external pressure. But the idyllic period of adaptation and acceptance could not last indefinitely. 3 weeks after their arrival at the village, scouts brought word that a large cavalry unit was moving through the area, questioning settlers and searching camps in what appeared to be a systematic effort to locate Sarah Beth and bring her back to white civilization. The tribal council met again, this time with greater urgency and more heated debate. Sarah Beth was allowed to attend as an observer, her growing understanding of Apache allowing her to follow most of the discussion, even when emotions ran too high for translation. The debate centered around a fundamental question: was protecting one white woman and her child worth the risk of military retaliation against the entire village? Some argued that Sarah Beth should be turned over to the soldiers to protect the community from consequences that could include imprisonment or death for everyone. Others maintained that she had become part of the tribe and deserved the same protection as any other member. Desbur listened to all arguments before rising to address the assembly with words that would determine Sarah Beth's fate and possibly the future of the entire community. This woman came to us not as conqueror or thief, but as mother seeking place for her child, the elderly leader said. She has learned our language, followed our customs, shown respect for our ways. Her child carries Apache blood and Apache spirit. She paused, her gaze moving around the circle of faces that represented the survivors of centuries of warfare and displacement. But soldiers will come, whether we give her up or not. White men see Apache village, they bring violence regardless of what we do or don't do. Better to face that violence protecting someone who has chosen to stand with us, than to face it alone, after betraying our own principles. The decision was made not by vote, but by the gradual consensus that emerged as individual voices expressed agreement with Desbur's reasoning. Sarah Beth would stay, and the village would prepare for the consequences of that choice. That night, as she nursed Ayanna in the wickiup she now shared with Koda, Sarah Beth felt the weight of responsibility for the dangers her presence might bring to these people who had accepted her as family. But she also felt the strength that came from belonging somewhere, from being part of a community that valued loyalty and courage over convenience and safety. "Are you sorry?" she asked Koda, as he prepared his weapons for whatever confrontation might be coming. "Sorry you chose to protect me instead of avoiding all this trouble." Koda paused in his work and looked at her with an expression that contained no doubt or regret. Apache saying, "It is better to die on your feet than live on your knees. We chose to stand for something worth defending. That is good way to live, good way to die if dying comes." Outside their shelter, the village prepared for war with the quiet efficiency of a people who had survived by being ready for anything. But inside, a small family went to sleep, surrounded by love and protected by the kind of community that most people could only dream of finding. Tomorrow would bring whatever challenges the white world was preparing to inflict on them. Tonight, they were home. The sound of approaching horses reached the village just before dawn, the steady rhythm of hoofbeats that suggested military discipline rather than casual travel. Sarah Beth woke to the soft touch of Koda's hand on her shoulder and the quiet urgency in his voice as he whispered for her to gather Ayanna and move to the center of the village where the women and children would be protected. Through the pre-dawn darkness, she could see the shadowy figures of Apache warriors taking positions around the perimeter of the camp, their movements silent and coordinated in ways that spoke of extensive practice with this kind of defensive preparation. These were not people caught off guard by military action. They were survivors who had learned to be ready for anything. Lieutenant Morrison's voice carried clearly across the morning air as he called for parley from a position just outside effective rifle range. "We know you're harboring a white woman and her child. Send them out and we'll withdraw without incident. Force us to come in after them, and we'll consider this village hostile and act accordingly." Sarah Beth felt Ayanna stir in her arms, the baby sensing the tension that had settled over the camp like morning fog. Around them, Apache women gathered their own children closer, their faces showing the kind of weary resignation that came from having lived through too many scenes like this one. Desbai emerged from her wickiup carrying herself with the dignity that had made her a respected leader for more than 2 decades. She walked toward the edge of the village with the measured pace of someone who refused to be hurried by threats or intimidated by superior firepower. "White soldier speaks of woman and child," she called back in English that carried only the slightest